and welcome to this Bitesize Technical video on scheme pays. An annual allowance charge arises when an individual's pension annual allowance has been exceeded in the tax year, be that the standard annual allowance, the tapered annual allowance or the money purchase annual allowance. Scheme pays is a mechanism by which the annual allowance charge can be paid out of a pension scheme rather than by the member personally. This has the advantage of the member not having to find additional funds to pay the charge. There are two types of scheme pays. The first is compulsory scheme pays. If certain conditions are met, then the scheme has to pay the charge. First, it is the main annual allowance that must be exceeded, i.e. £60,000 for the 2023-24 tax year and £40,000 for the tax years 2014-15 to 2022-23. Second, the annual allowance charge is at least £2,000. And third, the pension input amount in the scheme you're asking to pay the charge is above the annual allowance for the tax year concerned. If only the money purchase annual allowance or tapered annual allowance has been exceeded, then compulsory scheme pays cannot be used. However, it may still be possible to use voluntary scheme pays instead. More on that in a moment. For the scheme to be required to pay the charge, in most cases the member must notify the scheme by 31st of July in the tax year, 2 years after the tax year to which the annual allowance charge relates. For example, for a charge relating to the 2022-23 tax year, the notification must be received by 31st of July 2024. If the conditions are met and the scheme is notified before the deadlines, then the scheme will become jointly liable with the member for paying the charge. Voluntary scheme pays is much more flexible and can be used to pay any annual allowance charge, and the charge doesn't even have to have risen in the scheme that pays it. For example, if a defined benefit scheme has an input over the tapered annual allowance, but the member also holds a defined contribution scheme, the defined contribution scheme could potentially pay the charge. Of course, it is voluntary, so the scheme doesn't have to allow it, but in this scenario, it may be worth checking if this is an option. The liability for the annual allowance charge remains with the member, so the payment made by the scheme under voluntary scheme pays should also be paid by the member's normal self-assessment deadline. If this is missed, there is a risk of late payment charges. However, because pension schemes pay tax to HMRC on their quarterly returns, in order to guarantee HMRC get the money before the self-assessment deadline, the scheme needs to include it on their return for the period ending 30th of September, which they then have to pay to HMRC by 14th of November. If the request is received in quarter 4, 1st of October to 31st of December, this tax is only due to HMRC by 14th of February, so the 31st of January deadline may not be met. The scheme can still pay the charge on a voluntary basis at a later date, but there's a risk the member may receive a late payment interest charge. In practice, this charge hasn't always been applied when the self-assessment has stated that the scheme will be paying, but this can't be guaranteed. In order to pay an annual allowance charge under the voluntary rules, the scheme will need confirmation of pension input amounts to other schemes, if applicable, the amount of the charge, and the amount that the member wants the scheme to pay. It's also possible for the member to pay some of the charge personally and some from the scheme. Once the scheme has agreed to pay the charge, whether under compulsory or voluntary scheme pays, the member will need to complete the relevant information on their self-assessment. The amount of the excess above the annual allowance and the amount of the annual allowance charge to be paid by the scheme should be entered in the additional information pages under the Pension Savings Tax Charges section, along with the pension scheme tax reference number.